They told her there wasn't enough food for everyone. And then they closed the mill door in her face on the coldest morning of the year. A widow, a little girl, an 8-year-old with a stoneware jar clutched against her chest, the last warm thing they owned. No one argued. No one stepped forward. The whole town simply watched from behind frosted glass as a mother and her child were turned out into a gathering storm. They handed her a sack of ruined flour and called it mercy. They expected the mountains to finish what the cold morning had started. They were already speaking of her the way people speak of the dead. But she lifted that sack onto her shoulder. She took her daughter's hand, and instead of begging at doors that would never open, she turned and walked straight toward the one place the whole valley had chosen to forget. She was not walking off to die. She was walking toward something none of them could imagine. Snow had been falling over Coldwater Hollow for 3 days when the whole valley learned exactly how little a woman could be worth. Soft snow. Endless snow. The kind that drifts down so gently you forget it can bury you. But the coldest thing that morning did not fall from the sky. It came from the sound of a heavy door slamming shut. The great door of the flour mill closed in the face of a young widow named Della Voss, and the sound of it rolled across the frozen yard like a bone breaking. She did not flinch. She stood there in the falling white, her breath rising thin and slow, her eyes fixed on the wood grain of a door that had just decided her fate. Behind her, the town watched, from frosted windows, from shadowed porches, from behind curtains pulled back just far enough to see, and not far enough to be seen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke a single word. Since her husband was laid in the cold ground the spring before, Della had done every small and thankless job that mill could offer. She swept sawdust until the skin of her palms split. She stitched torn grain sacks by the last inch of a guttering candle. She counted inventory in storerooms, so cold her breath frosted on the shelves. All of it for one thing: a narrow space behind a plank wall, a place where she and her little girl could lie down out of the wind and pretend for a few hours that they still had a corner of the world to call their own. Everyone knew the arrangement was temporary. Everyone. And still, to force a mother and her 8-year-old child out the door on the very morning a blizzard was rolling down to swallow the valley whole. That was not a practical decision. That was a sentence. The mill owner was a broad, unhurried man named Harlan Crane. He stood beside a tall stack of flour sacks and spoke the way some men speak about the price of nails. Flat. Bored. Untouched. "There isn't enough food for everyone," he said. By the doorway stood the town's reverend, a thin, careful man named Amos Teague. He folded his pale hands and called it a necessary decision. A necessary decision. 3 soft words, used like a blanket, to cover something ugly. And the good people of Coldwater Hollow simply watched it happen. Nobody argued. Nobody stepped down off a porch. Nobody said, "Wait." Della took the verdict in silence. She did not beg. She did not weep. She did not give them the collapse they were bracing for. Because she had lived inside that mill long enough to know a secret the town did not want spoken aloud. The place was rotting. Slowly. Quietly. From the inside out. Months before, she had gone to Crane herself. She had shown him the moisture creeping through a sagging seam in the roof. She had watched damp air settle into the flour stores like a slow sickness. He had waved her off. Her warning vanished into the air. The leak stayed exactly where it was. A hard gust rattled the mill doors. Della lifted her chin and looked up at the darkening sky, then back at the man who had just cast her into it. "How many hours," she asked, her voice low and even, "before the storm reaches the valley?" It was not a plea. It was a question, steady, almost gentle, and it caught Harlan Crane completely off guard. He opened his mouth to answer, and found nothing waiting there. He only stared at her, this woman who would not shatter the way he had planned for her to shatter. Out in the snow-packed yard, a small figure was waiting. Nell, 8 years old, cheeks stung red by the wind, standing close against the warm flank of an old brown mule named Juniper. A scruffy dog named Scout pressed at her heels, refusing to leave the child's side. In her arms, the girl held something close, a little stoneware jar. She cradled it more carefully than anything else the two of them owned in this world, because inside that jar lived the sourdough starter her father had kept alive for years and years. A living thing. The last warm ember of a man who was gone. He had been a gentle sort of man, Nell's father. Not big, not loud. The kind of man a town like this one never quite noticed and never quite valued, until he was no longer there to do the 100 small kindnesses no one had ever thanked him for. He had fed that starter the way some men tend a garden, or a horse, or a dream. Every few days without fail, in good seasons and lean ones. He used to say a living thing kept alive through hard times carried something in it that store-bought never could. A memory, a stubbornness, a refusal to quit. He had said that about a great many things, actually. And Della, who had loved him without ever fully understanding the depth of what she was losing, only came to understand him now, months too late, as she stood in the snow holding the ruin of the life they had tried to build. He would not have wanted her to beg. She knew that much. He would not have wanted her to stand in that yard and plead with a man like Harlan Crane for a corner of a rotting mill. What he would have wanted, she thought, was harder to name, but it had something to do with that jar, with the stubborn, living thing his daughter now held against her heart, with the idea that some warmth, once kindled, was worth carrying through any cold, no matter how far you had to walk to find a place to set it down. Crane disappeared into the mill for a moment. When he came back, he carried what he had decided was a fair and generous parting gift: 1 damp sack of flour, a small handful of shriveled potatoes, an old shovel with a split and useless handle. He set them down in the snow, one by one, almost tenderly, as if he expected to be thanked. None came. Della lifted the flour sack. In the instant she felt the weight shift wrong in her arms, she understood everything. The flour had already begun to clump. The damp had gotten in long ago. The very rot she had warned him about was the parting gift he now pressed into her hands, and he did not even know it. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say to a man who had stopped listening a season ago. Snow hissed across the frozen yard as little Nell led the mule toward the road. Scout trotted behind, pausing only once to look back at the mill. As though the dog understood something the men inside never would. The widow lingered 1 heartbeat longer. Her eyes climbed to the roofline, to the warped, sagging boards buried under a crust of gray ice, the same section, the same leak she had begged him to mend, still there, and the silence around it. still there too. What settled deepest in her was not the loss of a warm room. It was not the empty stove, or the cold road stretching ahead into the white. It was the ease of it. No shocked faces, no raised voices, no single soul in the whole town asking whether any of it was right. Then a small voice reached up through the wind. "Do we still have a home?" For a long moment only the storm answered. Della looked down at her daughter, at the little jar clutched in those small chapped hands, at the trust still burning in the child's eyes, even now, even here. And something inside her refused to break, refused to bend, refused to give this town the frozen widow it already expected to find. She lifted the ruined sack higher onto her shoulder. She turned toward the road that climbed up and out of the valley, toward the high, forgotten country where no one ever bothered to go. "Not yet," she said. 2 words, quiet as a prayer, hard as river stone. The road out of Coldwater Hollow narrowed as it rose. Juniper leaned into the climb, hauling steadily through the deepening snow. Scout ranged ahead, vanishing into the white, then circling back to keep the little family together. And as the widow walked, her mind was not on the cold at all. It was on a memory, on long, quiet evenings by a low fire, when her husband would bend over a weathered old survey map borrowed from a passing crew and never quite given back. The map itself was nothing, but there was a note in the margin, a single line penciled in his careful hand, right beside a lonely crease in the mountains, a place folks had long forgotten, called Kettle Ravine. The ground there stays warmer than the land around it. At the time, no one had cared. It never became a story anyone repeated. Just a young man's curiosity, scratched onto old paper and set aside like a dream too small to chase. But Della remembered. She remembered exactly where those words were written. Ahead, the sky dropped another shade toward dark. The wind swept loose snow across the trail and erased their footprints almost as soon as they were made, as if the mountain itself wanted no record of their passing. Somewhere beyond the high ridges, the storm was gathering its full and terrible strength. And instead of turning back, instead of begging at doors that would only close again, the widow set her face toward the one place the whole town had chosen to forget. She did not know what waited for her up there in the cold. She only knew what lay behind her, a valley full of warm houses and people who had watched her walk away and said nothing. Ahead lay the unknown, the dark, the wind, and one thin, stubborn thread of something she was not yet ready to call hope. She tightened her grip on that ruined sack of flour, and she kept walking, because they were wrong about her, every last one of them. They believed they had seen the last of the widow Voss that morning. They whispered that, come the spring thaw, someone might find her frozen along that lonely mountain road, her little girl beside her. But the mountains were keeping a different story. And so was she. The storm caught them before they ever reached the ravine. The wind turned without warning, sweeping down off the high rocks and driving the snow sideways across the trail. It wiped away their tracks almost as fast as they made them, until it seemed the mountain itself wanted no proof they had ever passed this way. Juniper slipped twice on hidden ice. The old mule caught herself each time, snorting hard, her breath clouding the frozen air. Little Nell stumbled more than once, and then she went down hard into a drift, sinking to her shoulders in the soft white. Della reached her in an instant. She pulled the girl up by both arms. And that was when she saw it. The child's fingers had gone pale, too pale. The cold was no longer waiting politely at the edges of them. It had begun to reach inside. "Keep moving," the widow said, gentle but certain. "Stay close to Juniper. She's warm." Nell nodded. Her lips trembled, but she nodded, and she kept walking. There was no whimper in the child, no begging to turn back. Only that quiet, stubborn trust that her mother knew where they were going, even on a day when her mother was not entirely sure herself. Then something changed. Up ahead, Scout suddenly broke away from the trail. The dog had ranged back and forth all afternoon, nose low, tail tucked against the cold. But now he veered hard toward a rocky slope off to the side, and he began sniffing along the ground with a strange, urgent focus. Della slowed. She watched him work across the stone, and her tired eyes caught something they had nearly missed. The snow on that slope was thinner, much thinner. Everywhere else, the drifts lay deep and smooth, but here, dark patches of bare rock showed through the white, wet-looking against all that endless gray. And then she saw the vapor, a faint ribbon of it, rising off the stone and vanishing into the freezing air. She went very still. For the first time since that mill door had slammed shut behind her, she saw something that did not look like luck. It looked like a possibility. The rocky slope narrowed as she climbed toward it, drawing in tight between two pale walls of stone. At first glance, the gap between them seemed far too small to matter, too small to hold anything but shadow. But she pushed forward anyway, and she stepped inside, and the wind stopped. Not fully. It never fully stopped. But suddenly it was behind her, and above her, and no longer tearing at her face. The snow thinned to almost nothing beneath her boots. Bare ground appeared in patches along the narrow floor. The passage twisted once, sharp to the left, and then it opened. A wide, hushed space unfolded before them, walled in by tall cliffs of stone. A hollow the world had forgotten. A place that matched exactly a single line of pencil on an old map. Kettle Ravine. The silence inside was not complete. The storm still lived somewhere beyond those cliffs, howling its long song against the mountain. But in here, its voice sounded far away. Della knelt on the bare stone floor. She stripped the glove from one hand and pressed her fingers into the earth. It was cold, winter cold, but it was not frozen. The soil crumbled softly under her touch instead of ringing hard as iron. She dug a little deeper, felt the same thing. Ground that had somehow refused to freeze solid, while the whole valley below had turned to stone. Behind her, Nell waited in silence, both hands still wrapped around that little jar. Della closed her fingers around a handful of crumbling earth, and that pencil note, scribbled by a young man who was gone, that forgotten line no one had ever cared about. Suddenly it did not feel forgotten at all. It felt like a hand, reaching across a long and lonely distance to catch them just before they fell. Kettle Ravine stretched deeper than she had expected, and though the storm pressed at her back and the light was already fading, Della did not rush. She made herself slow down. She spent what daylight remained learning the place, the way a person learns the face of someone they might come to trust. The northern wall drew her first. The snow melted faster there. A few patches of exposed ground felt just slightly warmer than the rest. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would ever impress a crowd. But in the dead heart of winter, small differences meant everything. A shelf of sandstone hid something larger behind it, and when she worked her way around the outcrop, she found it. A broad alcove set back into the hillside. A pocket of stone with a roof already half formed by the overhang above. The floor was mostly dry. Thin beads of moisture clung to the limestone overhead, and that told her something important. It told her warmth was moving through hidden cracks somewhere below. One question remained, the most important one of all. Could the place breathe? A shelter that could not move its air would fill with smoke and steal the breath from their bodies while they slept. She had heard of such things happening to careless men. She would not let it happen to her child. So as the dusk came down, Della gathered a small handful of dry twigs, and near the mouth of the alcove, she built a tiny fire. She and Nell watched the smoke together. At first, it rose straight up, a thin gray thread, climbing toward the stone, and then it bent. Instead of drifting back into their faces, the smoke slid sideways. It curled deeper into the darkness of the alcove, and it vanished, pulled, drawn away by some steady, unseen current moving through the rock. The cave was breathing. It was drawing air through itself, slow and constant, the way a sleeping thing draws breath. Della watched a moment longer. Then she fed a few more sticks to the little flame. Outside, the storm was closing its fist over the mountains. But inside, the smoke had already given its answer. And for the first time since that door slammed shut, the widow let herself believe they might still be alive when morning came. The first 2 days disappeared into work, because Kettle Ravine offered possibility, but possibility did not stop the wind. It did not keep food dry. It did not build a place where a tired child could sleep through a long and bitter night. All of that still had to be made, by hand, by her own 2 hands. Della started with stone. The alcove sat beneath that sandstone overhang, which meant part of the roof already existed. That saved precious time. But the exposed side lay open to the wind, and that side would kill them if she let it. So Juniper hauled the smaller rocks up from the ravine floor, and Della rolled the larger ones into place herself, throwing her whole weight against them, her shoulders aching long after the light had gone. A rough windbreak rose slowly along the open side, uneven, crude, but growing. Meanwhile, little Nell had a task of her own. The girl gathered dead branches from beneath the ledges, tugging them free from where the snow had trapped them, dragging back armful after armful. Every single one mattered, because dry wood was already growing harder to find as the fresh snow buried the valley deeper by the hour. Scouts settled near the entrance whenever they worked. The dog rarely slept deep. Any strange sound out in the white brought his head up at once, ears sharp, eyes fixed on the dark. He was standing watch. Somehow, he understood. By the second afternoon, the shelter had begun to look like something a person had meant to build. Della raised a sleeping platform off the cold ground, framing it from poles and stone supports and salvaged brush. Keeping their bedding up and away from the floor would hold the heat and keep the damp from creeping in. Nearby, she built a simple hanging rack from forked branches and cord. Food could hang there, up above the reach of rodents, away from the wet pockets near the floor. None of it looked impressive. The walls leaned. The platform creaked when she pressed on it. The little storage rack tilted to one side no matter how she braced it. And yet, Every crooked piece of it solved a problem that Winter would have been glad to use against them. That night, the storm came in hard. The wind struck the cliffs and sent snow swirling past the mouth of the ravine. Somewhere out beyond the walls, the trails that led back down to the valley were disappearing under fresh drifts, one soft layer at a time. The road home was vanishing, but inside the alcove, the small fire burned steady. The windbreak held. The raised bed stayed dry, and the warm air lingered just a little longer than it had the night before. Long after Della had fallen into an exhausted sleep, little Nell lay curled beneath a blanket, the stoneware jar tucked close against her side, where she could feel it. But before that sleep took her, in the small hours when the storm was loudest against the cliffs, the child had spoken into the dark. "Mama, are you scared?" Della had lain still a moment, deciding how much of the truth a mother owes a frightened child. "A little," she admitted at last. "But less than I was this morning." "Why less?" Della had thought about that, about the door slamming shut, about the long cold road, about the vapor rising off the stone, and the smoke bending into the dark, and the ground that had refused to freeze. "Because this morning," she said, "I didn't know if there was any place in the world that would take us in. And now I do. It isn't much. It's cold, and it's hard, and there's a great deal of work ahead. But it took us in when nobody else would." The child was quiet, turning this over. "The mill didn't take us in," Nell said, "and it had a stove and walls and everything." "No," Della agreed softly. "It didn't. Funny, isn't it? A pile of cold stone in the middle of nowhere had more room for us than a whole town full of warm houses." She had felt her daughter's small hand find hers in the dark then, and hold on. "I like it better here," Nell whispered. "Even if it's cold, at least nobody's going to close the door on us." And Della, lying there in a hollow of stone with the storm screaming outside and her child's hand warm in hers, had understood that the girl had said something truer than she knew. And when morning came, the child had slept the whole night through. The first unbroken sleep she had found since the morning they were driven from the only home she had ever known. Far below, in the valley they had left behind, another kind of winter was settling in. Coldwater Hollow was beginning to feel the true weight of the cold. The flour stores, the ones the mill owner had refused to move away from that leaking roof, were shrinking faster than anyone had expected. And more of the grain than he cared to admit had gone soft and gray with damp. The town's shared baking oven had cracked along its chimney. Smoke leaked back into the workroom every time the wind turned. The baking slowed to a crawl. Children began to eat a little less at supper. The older folks, the ones who lived alone at the edges of town, struggled with the hard rations, the kind that needed more chewing than tired jaws could manage. And in a small house near the end of the lane, an old woman named Hetty Fenn sat by a low fire and quietly ate less so the wood would last longer. She was one of those the town forgot easily. No husband beside her now. No children living near. Just an old woman with a straight back and sharp, watchful eyes. She had stood at her window that cold morning, and she had watched a widow and a little girl walk out into the storm. She had said nothing then. Like all the others, she had said nothing. But unlike the others, she had not stopped thinking about it since. Something in that silence had settled into her chest like a stone, and it would not let her rest. Back in the ravine, the shelter was slowly becoming a home. And a home needed more than walls. It needed bread. On the third morning, Della followed a narrow passage that led beyond the main alcove. And there, deeper in the stone, she found a second chamber, smaller, warmer, surprisingly dry. And best of all, a thin crack ran through the ceiling, letting a single shaft of pale sunlight fall to the floor for a few hours each day. She stood there a long while, watching that light crawl slowly across the stone, and a plan began to take shape. This shelter would become more than a place to hide from the wind. It would become a system. The first part was clear. Bread meant warmth. Bread meant strength. And the sourdough starter Nell carried in that jar was far too precious to lose. The second part would take patience. If this cave truly held a steady thread of warmth, then perhaps, just perhaps, a small winter garden might be coaxed to life. Because along with the old map and the living starter, her husband had left one more thing behind. A small leather pouch of hardy seeds, winter rye, turnip, beet, kale. He had dreamed once of a garden of his own, a dream that was buried with him the spring before. When they were driven from the mill, Della had packed that pouch almost without thinking, clinging to a memory, never really believing the seeds would touch soil again. But now, beneath this fragile ribbon of light, those seeds were more than keepsakes. They were a chance. Her first oven was built from good instinct and far too little patience. She shaped wet clay around a low ring of stone, packed ash beneath it, fed the fire slowly until the little chamber glowed and seemed hot enough to work. The smell of rising dough filled the whole cave. Nell sat close, the sourdough jar in her lap, watching as though that oven might answer every question in the world at once. It answered, just not kindly. When Della drew the loaf out, the crust was dark and split wide open. Smoke clung to the surface, and inside the bread was heavy, wet, raw near the center. 3 whole days of saved flour had gone into that loaf. Nell broke off a piece anyway and tried to chew through the soft, doughy middle. She managed 2 bites. Then she quietly lowered her hand. For a moment, the two of them just looked at the ruined thing between them, and then the girl did something Della did not expect. She laughed, a small, tired laugh, but a real one. "It tastes like the bottom of a pond," Nell said, and Della, who had been so braced for tears, felt something in her chest come loose. She laughed too, for the first time since the door had closed. She pulled her daughter in against her side, and the two of them sat there in the firelight, passing the terrible loaf back and forth, taking turns describing exactly how bad it was. It was not much. A ruined loaf, and 2 people laughing over it in a cold cave. But it was the first ordinary joy they had shared since the valley. And it reminded Della of something the fear had made her forget. That they were not only surviving up here, they were still somehow a family. Still able to sit close and find something funny in the dark. That mattered as much as the bread, maybe more. When the laughter faded, Della studied the oven wall. Then the ruined loaf. The fire had touched the bread, but the heat had not stayed long enough to finish it. The oven had no mass, no memory. It gave up its warmth all at once, and then let it slip away into the cold. She understood now what she had done wrong. By morning, she was stacking sandstone. The second oven grew heavier. She thickened the clay walls. She built a wall of sandstone behind the fire chamber to hold the heat. She narrowed the mouth so the warmth would linger long after the coals were raked aside. The first failure had a lesson buried inside it, and she had listened. While the new oven dried, she turned to the garden chamber. The soil there needed help. It was thin and cold and lifeless. Nell carried leaf mold up from the sheltered corners of the ravine floor. Della mixed it with sand and crushed limestone and a little clean ash, working it with her bare hands until it looked like something a seed might forgive. Into that first small bed went the winter rye, the turnip, the beet, the kale. For 3 days, the little bed looked full of promise. And then the turnip leaves began to soften. By the next morning, several had collapsed against the soil, limp and gray. Della knelt beside the bed and looked up at the stone above it. A cold shine coated the limestone there. She reached up and touched it. Moisture, gathering on the stone, then dripping down, right onto the row where the turnips had died. The warmth had fooled her. Temperature was only one part of the problem. The stone was breathing damp into the wrong place, drowning the young roots while she slept. She pulled the dead turnip starts, one by one, and laid them beside the empty row. Nell watched from the passage, saying nothing. Della did not look away from the ruined plants. This failure had roots. It had a cause, and a cause could always be found if a person was willing to look long enough. She left the empty row untouched. Planting again right away would have felt like progress. It would also have been the very same mistake, made a second time. So instead, she studied. For 2 full days, she watched that chamber the way a hunter watches a game trail. Each morning began with a slow walk along the garden bed before she ever lit the fire. She marked the damp spots with small stones, learning where the water liked to gather in the dark. By afternoon, she tracked the narrow beam of sunlight as it slipped through the ceiling crack and crawled across the floor. And the darkness held its own clues. Moisture formed where warm air met cold stone. Certain sections of the wall stayed wet long after the others had dried. Nell helped. Whenever the girl found a fresh bead of water, she moved a pebble to mark the spot, and slowly a pattern emerged. The trouble always began along one edge, the far corner of the bed where the stone leaned close. That was where it wept. A thin drainage trench solved part of it, carrying the water away before it could pool and drown the roots. The rest needed space. Della cut willow branches down by the ravine floor and wove them into a light lattice, standing it a few inches out from the cold limestone wall. Now the air could move through that gap. Now the moisture had somewhere to go besides down onto her fragile seedlings. Nothing changed overnight. The kale simply stopped getting worse. And a few days later, the beet leaves found a little of their color again. That was enough. The chamber had taught her one more thing. Warm ground could grow food, yes, but warmth alone was never the whole story. Water and air and stone were all making decisions too. She had only to learn to listen to all of them at once. Standing there beside the mended bed, Della understood something that reached far past the garden. The dead turnips had never been proof that the garden could not work. They were only proof that she had been measuring the wrong thing, and that, she was learning, was the quiet difference between the people who survived a winter and the people who did not. The second loaf of bread demanded more patience than the first. Della fired the heavier oven longer. She let the sandstone drink in the heat, deep beneath its surface, and when the flames finally sank down to glowing coals, she waited. She let the dough rest. She let the oven rest. She rushed nothing at all. Dawn came pale and cold over the ravine, and when at last she eased that second loaf out into the light, its shape was uneven. One side had cracked in the bake. The crust carried its scars. None of that mattered, because this time the bread was cooked all the way through. Warm steam curled up through the split in the crust and drifted across the chamber, and the smell of it reached little Nell before the morning light did. The child opened her eyes, sat up beneath her blanket, and she followed that scent across the cave without a single word. Scout lifted his head from beside the warm oven and watched, quiet and content. Della cut the loaf on a flat stone. The larger piece went to her daughter. The smaller one stayed in her own hand. And out beyond the cliffs, the winter went on with its long, cold work. But it had lost something that morning. It had lost its certainty, because a warm loaf of bread now sat exactly where frozen ground and empty promises were supposed to have won. Nell closed her eyes after the first bite, and she held that warm piece of bread in both small hands, as if warmth itself had finally become something a person could hold on to. She looked up at her mother then, and for the first time in many days, she asked a question that had nothing to do with cold, or hunger, or fear. "Do you think Papa knew about this place?" Della went still. The question landed somewhere deep, somewhere she had been careful not to touch. She looked at the shaft of light falling through the stone, at the little jar that held a piece of him still living, at the seeds he had saved for a garden he never got to plant. "I think," she said softly, "he left us everything we needed to find it." And Nell smiled, a small, tired smile, but a real one. The first real smile since the door had closed behind them. Outside, the storm still ruled the mountains, but inside a forgotten hollow in the stone, a widow the whole town had left for dead was quietly, stubbornly building a life, and she was only just beginning. A week after that first true loaf, the winter came looking for her again, not with wind, not with cold, with something far quieter than either. It came for the one thing she thought she had already saved. The cave held. The warm ground kept its heat. The oven baked. And in the little garden, thin green leaves reached up toward their thread of light. For a few days, the shelter simply hummed along, and Della let herself feel something she had not felt in a long, long time. Steadiness. The sense that the ground beneath her would not shift again. She should have known better. It began with the jar, the sourdough starter, that small living thing her husband had kept breathing through so many hard seasons, began to slow. At first, Della told herself it was nothing. The mixture still smelled right when she lifted the cloth. It still looked healthy in the low firelight, pale and soft, but the dough would not climb the way it should. Each rising came slower than the last, sluggish, reluctant, as if the life inside had grown tired. She fed it, warmed it, watched it, and still it faded. Days went by, and with each dull, heavy loaf, the worry in her chest grew heavier too. Because that jar was not only bread, it was the last living piece of the man she had lost. A thing his hands had made, and tended, and carried, year after year. When he was buried in the spring, this had gone on breathing. This had stayed warm. This had refused to die with him. Nell had carried it out of the mill against her chest, more careful with it than with anything else they owned. And now, in Della's own keeping, it was slipping away. There is a particular kind of fear that belongs only to the ones who tend the sick, the fear of the slow decline, the thing you cannot fight because you cannot see it, the way you sit up through the night, watching for a change, willing your hands to be enough, and feeling them fail anyway. Della knew that fear intimately. She had lived it in the spring. She had sat beside a good man as the strength went out of him a little more each day. She had tried everything a person could try: warm broths, cool cloths, long nights of holding on, and none of it had been enough. She had learned in that season the cruelest lesson a loving heart can learn, that sometimes you do everything right and lose them anyway. That love, no matter how fierce, cannot always hold a person here. She had carried that lesson out of the valley like a stone sewn into her coat. And though she never spoke of it, it shaped every step she took. It was why she watched the smoke so carefully, why she studied the water, why she could not rest. Because somewhere beneath all her strength lived a quiet, frightened voice that whispered, "You were not enough for him. You will not be enough again." And now that voice had found something new to whisper over. The jar. If it went cold and still in her hands, the way he had, then the voice would be right. Nell felt the change in the cave before her mother said a word. The girl had a way of reading her mother's silences, and this silence was a heavy one. "It's not rising," Nell said quietly one evening. "Like before." "No," Della admitted. "It's not." The child was quiet a moment. Then, in the soft, unguarded way that only children can find their way straight to the center of a thing, she asked, "Is it going to die, like Papa did?" The question struck Della somewhere she kept carefully guarded. For a heartbeat, she could not answer at all. Then she gathered herself, the way she always did. She knelt down so her eyes were level with her daughter's. "I don't know yet," she said, and she did not soften it into a lie, because the girl deserved the truth. "But I'm going to fight for it, as hard as I can, and this time—" She stopped. This time, the frightened voice inside her finished, "Maybe it will be enough." She did not say that part out loud, but something in her face made Nell reach out and take her mother's hand, and the two of them sat together in the firelight, keeping watch over a small jar, the way people keep watch over anyone they are not ready to let go of. Della stopped guessing. Guessing, she had learned, was only fear wearing the costume of action, and fear had never once saved anything in that place. So she did the thing this cave had taught her over and over. She watched. She sat with the jar through the coldest, blackest hours, when the fire sank low and the dark leaned close against the stone. She kept her bare hand near it. She waited, and she paid attention with everything she had. And in the deepest part of one long night, she felt it. The floor. The stone beneath the jar was pulling the warmth away. The air near the warm wall stayed warm enough, but the cold rock underneath drank the heat straight out through the bottom of the jar, patient and endless, all through the darkest hours. The top stayed warm. The bottom went cold. And the living thing inside, caught between, slowed almost to sleep each night, and never quite woke before the next cold came for it. It was not one great blow killing the starter. It was a slow, nightly theft, so gradual you would never see it going until it was nearly gone, and Della, kneeling there, felt something turn over in her chest, because that was how she had lost him too, not all at once, slow, a little more each day, a warmth drawn quietly away in the dark, until one morning there was none left to wake. She had not been able to stop it then, but this she could stop. The fix was almost simple. Almost. She searched the back wall until she found the warmest stone of all, where the hidden heat rose closest to the surface and held even through the night. She cleared a hollow there, and she lifted the jar up off the cold, thieving floor and set it into the warmth. Then she reached for the last thing she had, his blanket. An old wool blanket, worn thin at the edges, folded away in the dark since the day they came. She had not been able to use it, not once all winter. To lay it over the bed, to let its warmth belong to the living, would have felt like admitting he was truly gone. So she had kept it folded, a small, aching shrine to a man she still could not fully release. For a long moment she held it against her chest and let herself feel the weight of it. And then a thought came, quiet and clear, and it loosened something in her. He had spent his whole life keeping this starter alive. He would not have wanted his blanket lying useless in the dark while the last of his work went cold a few feet away. He would have wanted it working, keeping something alive. That was who he had been. So she wrapped his blanket around the jar, slowly, gently, the way she might once have tucked it around him on a cold night in a life that was gone now. The warmth of the man, cradling the last living piece of the man. And as she pressed the wool close, she said so softly the fire nearly took the words, "You never could stand to see something you loved go cold." 2 mornings later, the bubbles came back, a few at first, then more, rising up through the pale mixture like breath returning to a chest that had lain too long still. Della lifted the cloth and looked down at that soft, living, stubborn thing. And she found she was weeping, not the hollow, helpless grief of the spring. Something else, something that felt almost like a hand laid gently on her shoulder. Because for a whole long winter, a voice inside her had insisted she was a woman who failed the ones she loved, who sat by, willing and desperate, while the warmth drained away in the dark. But here was proof against that voice. Small, bubbling, alive. This time, she had seen the theft. This time, she had understood it. This time, she had fought the slow cold in the dark, and won. She had not been enough, once, but she was enough now. Nell came and pressed against her side, and looked at the bubbles, and looked at the blanket wrapped warm around the jar. "It came back," the girl whispered, wondering. "It did," Della said. She drew her daughter close. "Some things do, when you catch them in time." And she let herself believe, for the first time since the spring, that catching things in time was something she was capable of. But the winter was not done teaching her yet. A few nights after the starter came back to life, Della woke in the black hours to a sound that did not belong. A slow, steady drip somewhere in the dark. Not the drip of the garden chamber, which she knew by heart. Something new. Something wrong. She rose without waking Nell and followed the sound with a small brand from the fire. It led her to the low place near the back of the alcove where their water had always gathered. All winter, A thin trickle had run down the stone there, feeding a shallow basin she had hollowed out to catch it. Clean water, warmed just enough by the hidden heat below to stay liquid while the whole world froze. It had been one of the ravine's quiet gifts, and she had come to depend on it without ever quite thinking about it. Now the basin was nearly empty, and the trickle that fed it had slowed to almost nothing. Della crouched over it a long time, watching a single bead of water gather, swell, and fall. Then another, slower than before, far slower. The deep cold had reached down into the stone, further than it ever had, and somewhere up above, in the hidden veins of the rock, the water was beginning to freeze in its own channels. It was a small thing, at first, but she did the arithmetic in the firelight, the way she did everything now, and the arithmetic frightened her. 2 people and a mule and a dog needed water every single day. The garden needed water. The bread needed water. And if the source that fed them was closing up, 1 cold degree at a time, then all of it, every green leaf and every warm loaf and every living thing in that cave, was standing on ground that could vanish. She could melt snow. She knew that. But melting snow ate firewood, and firewood was already the thing she watched most carefully, hoarding every dry stick against the long weeks still ahead. To melt enough water for all of them every day would burn through her wood faster than she could gather it. It would be robbing one lifeline to feed another. She sat with the problem for 2 days. She did what she always did. She stopped trying to force an answer and let the ravine show her one, and slowly, watching the way the faint warmth moved through the stone, she understood something. The water was not gone. It was only frozen in the wrong place, up in the cold outer rock where the hidden heat could not reach it. If she could not bring the heat to the water, then she would have to bring the water to the heat. She spent a hard day chipping a shallow channel across the warm stone at the back of the chamber, guiding it down toward her basin. She packed the seams with clay. She laid flat stones over the top to hold the warmth in, so the water would run beneath a roof of heated rock, sheltered from the killing cold of the air. Then she waited, the way she had learned to wait. By the second morning, the basin was filling again, slower than before, but steady. A thin, patient thread of water coaxed down out of the freezing dark and into the warmth, where it could keep on running. Della knelt beside it and watched it fill, and she felt the particular, quiet satisfaction that had become the truest reward of that whole hard season. Not triumph. Something smaller and deeper than triumph. The satisfaction of a problem seen clearly and answered honestly with her own 2 hands. She was becoming a woman who did not panic when the ground shifted beneath her. A woman who trusted that most troubles, looked at long enough and without fear, would show you the shape of their own solution. The valley had thrown her out, believing she was helpless. She was learning, one frozen trickle at a time, exactly how wrong they had been. For a while after that, the winter gave them room. The garden came into its strength. The kale broadened. The rye stood green and straight. The beets pushed out new leaves toward the light. Nell tended it as though it were her own, walking the rows each morning, murmuring to the young plants the way she had once heard her father murmur to his. Snares along the hair trails brought meat and rich, dark broth, and warm pelts for the sleeping platform. The cave grew full in small, hard-won ways, and Della let herself feel that they were no longer merely holding on. They were living. But she had already learned, that very season, what comfort could do to a watchful eye. She had simply let herself forget it. The wind came from a direction it had never come before. Late one afternoon, with no warning at all, it dropped down through the high rocks and struck the alcove sideways. Sudden, hard, like a door slammed by an angry hand. Juniper shied and lunged against her tether, and the windbreak, the very part Della had built up strongest, took the blow and came down in a heap of stone and dust. She was on her feet at once, pulling Nell clear, shielding the girl with her body as the last rock settled. And when the dust cleared, a new trouble had already begun. The smoke that always slid away into the dark had begun, thread by thin thread, to drift back toward them. By sunset, the chamber smelled wrong, sharp, heavy. By full dark, the air had gone hazy and thick, and Nell, trying to sleep, kept coughing, kept turning, kept pressing her face into the blanket as the smoke found her again and again. "Mama," she whispered at last, "it hurts to breathe." And Della went cold all the way through, because this exact thing, a child she loved, struggling to breathe in the dark, while she stood over her with willing hands and no answer. This was the spring again. This was the very nightmare she had sworn would never find her twice. She worked through the night, and at first she worked in pure fear. She was certain the fallen stones had sealed some passage. So she tore at them, hauling rock until her hands split and bled, breathing the thickening air in ragged gulps. Still the smoke came. She pulled down another section of wall, hunting the blockage she was so sure was there. She worked until her arms shook and the gray haze swam in front of her eyes. Still the smoke came, and the old panic swelled up in her, the very same panic from that other endless night. The sick, rising certainty that she was doing everything, and it would not be enough. That she was, after all, exactly the woman she feared herself to be, the one who tries with all her heart and loses anyway. Nell watched from the blanket, silent, her eyes wide and red and frightened, and Della felt the floor of her own courage begin to give way beneath her. She thought of the valley below, the warm houses, the full lamps, all those people who had watched her walk away and said nothing. Not one of them would come. Not one of them even knew there was still a life up here to be saved. She had never in her life been so alone. And then, near dawn, worn down to almost nothing, she stopped. She made herself stop. Because through the exhaustion, through the fear, a quiet truth surfaced in her. The truth this whole winter had been trying to teach her. Fear tears things apart. Only patience ever finds the cause. She had flung every frantic remedy at her husband's fading, and none of it had turned him back. But this was not that. This was not a body slipping beyond her reach. This was stone, and air, and smoke. And those things obeyed rules a patient woman could read. She had not been able to read the illness, but she could read this. If only she would stop tearing at the world with her bare hands and watch. So she lit a small, fresh fire, and she sat back on her heels in the smoky dark, hands finally still, and she watched, and the smoke told her the truth. It was not the fallen wall that had choked the cave. It was the wall she had rebuilt, the strong one, the one she had been proud of. In sealing off the wind, She had strangled the very draft that let the whole place breathe. The cave still wanted to pull its air through the old way it always had, but her fine, strong wall was forcing that air down the wrong road. And the smoke, with nowhere clean left to go, had turned back on the ones who made it. The danger had not come from the storm outside. It had come from her own careful hands, from the very thing she had built to keep them safe. And Della, kneeling in the gray light, felt the whole shape of it settle over her, and it reached far past the smoke. For an entire winter, she had carried the spring like a stone. She had believed that when it mattered most, she had failed him, that her care had not been enough, that love, however fierce, was simply too weak to hold back the dark. But that had never been the true lesson. The true lesson was this: some things cannot be saved, no matter what we do, because they were never ours to save. His illness had not been a wall she built. It had been a storm no hands could turn. She had not failed him. She had simply been human in the face of something no human could stop. But this smoke, this she had made. And what a person builds with her own hands, a person can also open. She had spent the whole night fighting the smoke as though it were the illness come again, as though she were once more that helpless woman at the bedside. But she was not helpless here. She never had been. She only had to set down the old grief long enough to see clearly. She rose and went to the barrier she had loved so much, and she began, carefully, to take part of it back down. Not all of it. She was wiser now. She would not swing from one mistake straight into its opposite. She cut one clean channel, low along the base, right where the cave wanted its breath to flow. Then she lit a handful of dry twigs, and she watched. The little plume of smoke rose. It climbed. It bent toward the back of the cave, and it slid away into the darkness, gone, just as it had on that very first night. Della let out a long, shaking breath, a breath she felt she had been holding since sundown, since the spring, since a bedside she had never once forgiven herself for leaving. The cave was breathing again. "It's going the right way now," Nell whispered, her small body finally, slowly beginning to ease. "It is," Della said, and her voice caught. "It is, sweet girl. We can breathe now, both of us." And she meant it in every way the words could be meant. She lay down beside her daughter as the first pale light crept into the ravine. She was far too tired to feel any pride, but she felt something steadier than pride, something that had been a long, long time coming, because that other night, the one she had carried like a stone all winter, had convinced her she was a woman who failed the people she loved. But this night had answered it. This night, she had faced the very same helplessness, the very same beloved child, struggling to breathe in the dark. And this time, she had not failed. This time, she had found the cause and opened the wall, and now, the one she loved was breathing soft and easy at her side. She could not go back and change the spring. She would carry it with her always. But she was no longer the woman who had knelt helpless at that bedside. This place had been quietly remaking her all winter long into someone else. Someone who did not flail, but watched. Someone who did not surrender to despair, but listened. Someone who could take apart the work of her own hands and even open the walls of her own grief. when the ones she loved needed the air to breathe. The spring had taken a husband from her, and it had left her believing her love was not enough. This winter was giving something back. The belief that her love, joined to patience, joined to open and watchful eyes, was a real force in the world, a force that could hold back the cold. Outside, the wind wandered off across the ridges, looking for other walls to test. Inside, a widow and her daughter slept at last, breathing clean, cold air, in a home that had survived one more hard lesson. And Della, drifting toward sleep, finally understood what the winter had truly been building in her all this time. Not just a shelter, not just a way to live through the cold, a way, at long last, to lay down a stone she had carried far too long, a way to forgive herself. And that, more than the bread, more than the green garden, more than the warm stone walls around them, was the thing that was going to carry her all the way through to spring. Day 46 began like any other morning inside Kettle Ravine. The fire had burned down to a soft orange glow. Fresh dough rested beneath a cloth near the warm limestone wall, breathing slowly, patiently, the way it should. A thin beam of pale light had just reached into the garden chamber, laying itself across the young rows of green. And then Scout lifted his head. The dog did not bark. That was what caught Della's attention. He simply stood, ears forward, body still, staring toward the mouth of the ravine, at something the widow could not yet see. Della set down the basket she was carrying, and she listened. Far off, between the tall walls of stone, came a sound she had not heard in a long, long time. Footsteps, not the wander of an animal, not the aimless shuffle of a creature lost in the snow. Footsteps that came straight on, steady, certain. Someone was walking toward the shelter, not searching, coming, and in the space of a single breath, the whole warm world she had built seemed to go fragile around her. Because she had let herself forget these past weeks that the valley existed at all. She had filled the days with bread and green things and the quiet rhythm of keeping her daughter safe. And somewhere in all that work, she had stopped bracing for the world to reach up and take it back. Now the world was reaching, she thought, in that first cold instant of every hard possibility. A man come to drive them off, a claim on the land. Word that the law, or something wearing the face of the law, had decided a widow and a child could not simply vanish into the mountains and live. She thought of the mill door slamming shut, and she felt, rising up in her, something she had not felt since that morning. The old readiness to be cast out. The old certainty that whatever she built, someone with more power would arrive to decide it was not truly hers. Her hand went, without her deciding it, to her daughter's shoulder. "Nell," she said quietly, "come stand by me." The girl came, and the two of them stood together at the mouth of their home, watching the twist in the stone where the footsteps would appear, while a scruffy dog planted himself in front of them both and waited, low and still, for whatever was coming. Out beyond the ravine, a man was following a trail that should not have existed. His name was Silas Reed, and in that small town below, he was the one who carried the winter mail and mended saddles when the weather kept everyone close to their fires. A quiet man, a watchful one. The town had long since decided the widow was gone. Most folks believed the first great storm had settled the matter weeks ago. They spoke of her, when they spoke of her at all in the soft past tense people use for the dead, Silas Reed had never been so sure. He was a man who noticed things others missed. And something about the way that woman had walked out of the valley, straight-backed, unbroken, a little girl at her side, and a jar held tight in the child's arms, had never sat right with him. She had not walked like someone going off to die. She had walked like someone going somewhere. So when his rounds brought him up toward the high country, he let his curiosity lead him a little further than it should have, up a trail that folded into the mountains, toward a crease in the rock the maps had all forgotten. And that was when the smell stopped him cold. He caught it before he ever saw the shelter. Bread, fresh bread. For several long seconds, Silas Reed simply stood in the frozen air, trying to make sense of what his own senses were telling him. Because there was no bread up here. There was nothing up here. Only stone and snow, and the long white silence of a place no one came. And yet, the scent grew stronger as he moved forward. Warm, rich, impossibly alive. He rounded the last shoulder of rock, and the shelter opened up before him. He stopped walking altogether, because what lay before him was not the frozen ruin the town expected. It was not the sad end of a foolish woman who had wandered into the mountains to die. It was a home. A stone oven sat near the back wall, still warm, a thread of smoke curling neatly up and away into the dark. Dry firewood was stacked beside it, sorted and squared. Blankets covered a raised sleeping platform, lifted up off the cold ground. Bundles of food hung from a storage rack overhead. Near the entrance, the old mule stood healthy and well-fed, sheltered behind a wall of stone and timber that broke the wind. But none of that struck Silas Reed the way the garden did. Green leaves, reaching upward, beneath a shaft of pale sunlight that fell through a crack in the ceiling stone. Kale, young rye, beet greens, life, growing, in the dead heart of winter. He stepped slowly into the chamber and drew the gloves from his hands, hardly aware that he was doing it. His eyes moved from the oven to the crops, then to the warm walls all around him. The whole place felt impossible. Not the way a miracle is impossible. Impossible the way a solved problem always looks to a person who never saw the hundreds of small failures buried underneath it. Nell came out of the garden chamber first, carrying a small basket of trimmed greens. Della followed a moment later. Neither of them looked surprised to see another human being standing in their shelter. The surprise belonged entirely to Silas Reed. He looked at the widow the whole town had buried in its mind, standing there, alive, straight-backed, steady-eyed, a woman who had walked into the mountains with a ruined sack of flour and a child, and had built a living world out of stone. On a flat rock near the oven rested a loaf that had come out only a short while before. Steam still rose from a crack along its crust. Silas stared at it far longer than he meant to. Beyond the limestone gap, the snow drifted on through the gray air, the way it had for weeks. But the man stood rooted where he was, wrapped completely in the warm, rich scent of fresh bread and stubborn, defiant life. The widow they had all expected to find frozen was standing beside a working oven. "You're alive," he finally managed. Della almost smiled at that. "We are," she said simply. "Come in out of the cold. There's broth." Silas Reed stayed most of the afternoon. He sat where she gestured, near the warmth of the oven, and he accepted a cup of the dark, rich broth she pressed into his hands. He drank it slowly, and he watched the two of them move through the shelter with the easy rhythm of people who knew exactly where everything was and why. For a while, he did not say much of anything. He was a man taking the measure of something he did not fully understand. And then, at last, the talk turned back toward the town below. The news was not good. The flour stores were shrinking faster than anyone had expected. Moisture had spoiled more of the grain than the mill owner wanted to admit, the very damp the widow had warned him about so many months ago. Several families were stretching their meals thin now, adding boiled roots and whatever dried scraps remained from the autumn. The town's shared baking oven had cracked along its chimney. Smoke leaked into the workroom every time the wind shifted, and the baking had slowed to almost nothing. The children were eating less. The older folks, the ones alone at the edges of things, struggled with hard rations that asked more of tired jaws than tired jaws could give. Della listened to all of it without once interrupting, but she did not listen the way a person listens to gossip. She listened the way she listened to the smoke and the water and the failing dough, closely, turning each piece over, looking for the pattern underneath. And then she began to ask her own questions. How much flour is left? Which households are struggling the most? Who has children? Who has old ones living alone? The answers came one at a time, and Silas noticed something as he gave them. She was not asking out of idle worry. She was asking the way a person asks when they are all ready, quietly, beginning to plan. When at last he had finished, a silence settled over the chamber. The oven ticked softly as it cooled. The thin shaft of light drifted slowly across the rows of winter greens. Della looked toward the garden, then toward the fresh loaf resting beside the hearth, and her decision arrived quietly, the way all her decisions did, without speeches, without weighing what she owed anyone or what anyone owed her. The first deliveries go to the families with the greatest need, she said. Bread, kale, beets, whatever we can spare. Silas Reed went very still. He had understood, more or less, what she was offering. Food, from a woman who had almost nothing, sent down to a town that had far more than she did, and had given her nothing but a closed door. But it was who appeared on her list that stopped him cold. Because several of those names belonged to people who had stood on their porches and watched her walk away without a single word. One name belonged to a household that had openly supported the mill owner's decision to turn her out, and another belonged to a woman who had looked straight through the widow on the day she needed help most, and turned back to her own warm fire. Silas looked at Della, and he could not keep the question from his face. After what they did, he said slowly, you'd feed them first? Della was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the loaf, at the steam still curling from its crust, at the small hands of her daughter, who had carried a jar of living hope out of a place that had cast them both aside. They were wrong to do what they did, she said at last. I won't pretend they weren't. She lifted the loaf gently in both hands. But a hungry child doesn't get to choose their parents, and an old woman freezing alone didn't build that mill or make that decision. She set the loaf into a waiting cloth. If I only feed the ones who were kind to me, then I've learned nothing up here at all. Silas Reed had no answer for that. He simply nodded, because there was nothing to add, and by sunset, he was helping her prepare the first sacks for the long journey back down. But there was one name Della had held back. She had not spoken it aloud when Silas listed the households in need. She had only gone very still when he mentioned an old woman living alone at the end of a lane, who had grown too proud to ask anyone for help and too frail to manage the hard winter rations on her own. Hetty Fenn. Della remembered her. She remembered a straight-backed old woman at a frosted window on the morning the mill door closed. One more face among the many who had watched and said nothing. But she remembered something else too. She remembered that of all those silent faces, only one had looked troubled. Only one had not quite been able to meet her eyes. Only one had lifted a hand toward the glass, and then let it fall. "Send bread to the old woman at the end of the lane," Della said quietly. "The one who lives alone." Silas glanced up. "She never had much good to say about anyone," he offered. Not unkindly. Just honestly. "No," Della agreed, "but she watched me go, and I think she's been carrying it ever since." She did not explain how she knew. She only knew. Some people wound you and never feel it, and some people wound you and carry the wound themselves longer than you ever will. "Send her the bread," Della said again, "and don't tell her who it came from." That evening, after Silas Reed had gone, the shelter felt different, fuller somehow, and also, strangely, more fragile, because a door had opened. The world had found them. And Della lay awake for a long while that night, turning it over, the way she turned everything over. Nell beside her was not asleep either. The girl had been quiet all evening. Too quiet. And Della had learned by now that her daughter's silences carried weight. "Mama," the child said at last, into the dark. "I'm here." Nell was quiet another moment, and then the fear came out of her, small and trembling, the way the deepest fears always come out of children when the lamps are low. "When the man came, I thought he was going to make us go." Della turned toward her. "Make us go where?" "Back." Nell's voice was very small. "Or somewhere else. I thought maybe he'd found us, and now we'd have to leave. And I don't want to leave. This is ours." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "Every time something's good, somebody makes us go," the girl whispered. "The mill was good, and they made us go. What if we're not allowed to keep things?" And there it was. The wound the town had cut into her daughter, laid bare in the dark. Not the cold, not the hunger. Those a child could survive. But the deep, quiet terror of a little one who had learned, too young, that safety could be taken away without warning, that being cast out could happen to anyone, at any time, for no reason a child could understand, that she might not be allowed to keep the things she loved. Della felt that fear land in her chest because she knew it. She had carried her own version of it all winter. The terror of losing what mattered. The dread that her love would not be enough to hold on to anything. For a long moment, she did not reach for easy comfort. Because easy comfort, she had learned, was its own kind of lie. "Come here," she said softly, and she gathered her daughter in against her and held her and felt the small body slowly stop trembling. "I'm going to tell you something true," Della said, "and I need you to really hear it." Nell went still, listening. "They didn't make us leave the mill because there was something wrong with us," Della said. "They made us leave because there was something wrong with them, with their fear, with their hearts that morning." She smoothed the girl's hair back from her face. That was never about whether we deserved to stay, sweetheart. Do you understand? It was never about that. Nell was quiet, taking it in. But this place, Della went on, and her voice grew steadier, warmer. This place, no one gave to us. No one can take it back because no one handed it to us in the first place. We made it, stone by stone, loaf by loaf, with our own hands. She pressed a kiss to the top of her daughter's head. And the things you build with your own hands, those are yours. Nobody can close a door on those. Not ever again. She felt the girl breathe out, long and slow, some knot inside her, loosening. You promise? Nell whispered. And Della, who had spent a whole winter learning not to make promises she could not keep, thought carefully before she answered. I promise you this, she said. As long as there is breath in me, I will never let anyone make you feel the way they made you feel that morning. Never again. That much I can promise. It was not a promise that the world would always be kind. It was a promise that she would stand between her child and its unkindness for as long as she was able. And for a little girl who had learned too young that homes could vanish, that was enough. She fell asleep in her mother's arms and did not stir again until morning. Della lay awake a while longer, listening to her daughter breathe. And she found herself thinking, not with anger, but with something quieter, of the town below, of the closed door, of the silent porches, of all the ways a group of frightened people had made two of their own feel unwelcome in the world. They had thought they were doing the practical thing, the necessary thing. They had not seen the child they were teaching to be afraid. And Della understood, lying there in the warm dark, that she was not sending bread down that mountain to prove them wrong. She was not doing it to shame them, or to win, or to hear an apology she no longer needed. She was doing it because somewhere down in that cold valley was a child who had learned, that winter, to eat a little less at supper. A child who was learning the very same fear her Nell had just whispered into the dark. And no child, Della thought, should have to learn that fear. Not the ones up here, and not the ones down there. Whatever their parents had done. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm took hold. Whenever the weather allowed, Silas Reed made the long trip up from the valley and back. He carried letters when there were any, small supplies when he could spare them. And he returned each time with whatever the cave could give. Bread wrapped warm in cloth, kale, and beet greens. Once, a small share of precious broth for a family with a sick child. The bread oven grew more reliable with every firing. The garden gave more with every passing week. And down in the town, something began to change. No one knew where the food was coming from. Stories rose up before the facts did. Some said a trapper had found a hidden cache. Some whispered of a rancher beyond the mountains, sending help in secret. But the plain sacks kept arriving. No announcements, no names. And children who had been growing thin began to grow strong again. In a small cabin at the low end of the valley, a young mother named Wren Halloway had spent weeks watching her son push his food around his plate. The boy had been born small and stayed small. And that winter, with the rations thinning, she had begun to lie awake, counting his breaths in the dark, the way frightened mothers do. Then the loaves started coming. She never saw who left them, only found them, wrapped in clean cloth, resting on the flat stone by her door in the gray hour before dawn, still warm some mornings, as though they had been carried a long way with great care. The first time she had been afraid to trust it. She had turned the loaf over in her hands, searching for the trick in it, the hidden price. She had lived long enough to know that free things usually cost the most. But there was no trick. There was only bread. And one evening, near the end of a hard week, she set a thick slice of it in front of her boy, dark and crusted, and still faintly warm from wherever it had come. And she watched him eat. He ate the first piece, and then he reached for another, and then, without being asked, a third. By the end of the meal, there was nothing left on the table but a scatter of crumbs. For the first time in longer than she could remember, her child had finished everything set before him. Wren Holloway sat very still after he had gone to sleep, looking at that empty plate in the low firelight, and something she had been holding tight in her chest for weeks finally let go, and she put her face in her hands, and she cried the way a person cries only when a fear has lifted. She did not know the name of the woman who had fed her son, but she blessed her, whoever she was, with everything she had. Several old ones, too, survived cold spells that had frightened their families only weeks before. At the end of one lane, an old woman named Hetty Fenn opened her door one gray morning to find a still warm loaf resting on her step, wrapped in clean cloth, with no name and no note. She stood there a long time, holding it, and though no one saw her do it, the straight-backed old woman who never had a kind word for anyone pressed that warm loaf against her chest and bowed her head and wept. Because somehow, in a way she could not explain, she knew. She knew exactly whose hands had made it. And she knew, at last, the true weight of a morning she had spent all winter trying not to remember. The morning she had stood at a window and lifted her hand toward the glass and let it fall. She set the loaf on her table. She did not eat it right away. She simply looked at it for a long while, this gift from a woman she had failed, and something in the old woman's heart, frozen hard for many years, began, very quietly, to thaw. The cave received no credit for any of it. The widow received no thanks, no praise, for now the results traveled faster than the story behind them, and Della was content to have it so. Because she had not done it to be seen. She had done it because a child up here had needed to learn that homes could be built and kept, that the world was not only made of closed doors, and because the children down there needed to eat, and because an old woman at the end of a lane needed to know, without a single word being spoken, that she had been forgiven long before she ever found the courage to ask. Outside, the winter went on across the ridges, exactly as it always had. But inside a hollow of warm stone, a widow the whole town had left for dead was quietly feeding the very people who had turned their backs on her, not to win, not to be repaid, but because she had finally understood the thing the cold had been trying to teach her all along, that the warmth you refuse to give away goes cold in your own hands, and the warmth you send out into the dark, freely, asking nothing, somehow always finds its way back home. The storm that finally broke the town was the same one the whole valley had feared all winter. For 2 days and 2 nights, the wind came down off the mountains without mercy. Snow piled against the walls of every house. Ice formed where ice had no business forming. And then, sometime before the first gray light of the third morning, part of the great flour warehouse roof gave way. It did not fall all at once, with a crash to wake the town. It sagged, it buckled, it let go quietly, in the dark, in exactly the place where a young widow had once stood in the cold, and pointed, and been waved away. The damage spread fast, the way rot always does once it wins. Water crept into the storerooms. The flour that remained drank it up, and turned soft, and turned gray, and turned to nothing anyone could bake. Whole sections of the town's reserve became useless within days, and at nearly the same hour, as though the winter had timed it, the shared baking oven failed for good. The crack in its chimney widened until the draft died. Smoke rolled back into the workroom. The fires would not catch. The baking stopped, and the town woke to a question it could no longer avoid. Where had the bread been coming from all winter? Because now, with their own stores ruined and their own oven cold, they suddenly, desperately, needed to know. The answer came in a crowded meeting inside the church hall. The whole town packed in, shoulder to shoulder, coats still dusted with snow, faces pinched with a fear they were only beginning to admit to one another. And Silas Reed stood up before them, the quiet man who carried the winter mail, the man who had spent weeks listening to them invent their comfortable little theories, the hidden cache, the generous stranger, the rancher beyond the mountains. He let them murmur for a moment, and then he told them the truth. The bread, the kale, the winter greens, the broth that had kept more than one child breathing through the worst of the cold, all of it had come from a hollow in the high rocks called Kettle Ravine. And all of it had come from the hands of the widow, the one they had turned out into the storm, the one they had all quietly agreed was dead. A deep and awful silence fell over the hall. The carpenter, Caleb Dorr, who had spent the whole winter mocking the very idea that anyone could survive up there, stared with his mouth slightly open and found nothing to say. The Reverend Amos Teague, who had once folded his pale hands and called her leaving a necessary decision, could not find a single word. And near the back of the hall, the mill owner, Harlan Crane, lowered his eyes to the floor, because every soul in that room was doing the same terrible arithmetic at once. They had expected the widow to die. Instead, she had built a shelter out of forgotten stone. She had grown food where nothing could grow. She had baked bread when their own ovens failed. And while the whole town slowly starved itself thin, that same discarded widow had been quietly feeding them, their children, their elders, the very hands that had shut the door on her. Harlan Crane did not lift his eyes for a long, long time, but this is not a story about a town brought to its knees, and it is not, in the end, a story about the widow being proven right. Because up in the ravine, on the very morning the warehouse roof came down in the valley below, Della Voss was facing a quiet reckoning of her own, one that had nothing to do with the town at all. The winter was turning. She could feel it in the air that moved through the ravine, a softness at the edges of the cold, the drip of melt from the high rocks in the strongest hours of afternoon, the light lingering a little longer each evening on the garden rows. Spring was coming, and spring meant something Della had not let herself think about all winter. It meant they could leave. The passes would open, the trails would clear, the world would become crossable again, and the thing that had been, all season, a desperate refuge, would become simply a choice. Stay or go. And Della found to her own surprise that she did not know the answer. That was the true crisis of those final weeks. Not the storm, not the town. It was a question she had been too busy surviving to ask. What now? All winter, the answer to every question had been the same. Survive the night, fix the leak, feed the child, bake the bread. There had been a brutal, blessed clarity in it. When you are only trying to live until morning, you never have to ask what your life is for. But now the mornings were assured. The danger was passing. And into the space where the fear had lived, a harder question crept. Because the truth was this: down in that valley was a whole life she had lost, a church she had married in, a plot of ground where a good man lay buried, neighbors she had known since girlhood, a history, a belonging, however cruelly it had failed her, and a part of her ached for it still, even after everything, because that is the thing no one tells you about being cast out. You do not stop loving the place that hurt you. You just learn to love it from a distance, like a light in a window you are no longer welcome to sit beside. Della stood at the mouth of her shelter one evening, looking down at the far scatter of lights in the valley, and she felt the old pull of it in her chest. Home, or what had once been home. Could a person go back? After being thrown away, could a person ever really go back? And underneath that question sat a deeper one, the one that frightened her most of all. If she could not go back and could not bear to leave, then what exactly had this winter made her into? A woman with no place in the world below, and no name for the place she had built above. Nell felt the change in her mother before a word was spoken. Children always do. The girl had been strange and quiet for days, and one evening, curled beneath her blanket in the warm dark, she finally let the fear out. "The snow's melting," Nell said. "It is," Della answered. A long pause. "Are we going to leave?" And there it was. The very question Della could not answer for herself, handed up to her by her own child. She was quiet a moment. "I don't know yet, sweet girl," she said, and she would not lie to soften it. "Would you want to go back down?" Nell thought about it for a long time, longer than a child usually thinks about anything. "I don't know," the girl admitted at last. "Down there is where Papa is." Della's breath caught. "But up here," Nell went on, slowly, working it out as she spoke, "is where we're us. Down there, we were the people they made leave. Up here, we're the people who made all this." She looked around the glowing chamber, at the oven, at the green rose, at the jar, alive against the warm stone. "I don't want to be the people they made leave again," the girl whispered. And Della understood then that her daughter had put her finger on the very thing she herself had been circling for days. It was not about the place at all. It was about who they got to be. The visitors came the next week, up from the valley, once the truth had spread. Some out of curiosity, some because they had run out of explanations. The mill owner walked near the front, the carpenter beside him, the reverend a little behind, saying nothing the whole climb up. The ravine, when they reached it, looked smaller than any of them had imagined. There were no hidden machines, no buried treasure, no miracle. What they found instead was work, the drainage trench, the willow lattice, the heavy thermal oven, built from clay and sandstone, and 100 patient corrections. The garden, reaching for its thin shaft of light. Nothing looked magical. Everything looked earned. And the town, standing inside the proof of what one cast-out woman had built, offered her the thing they thought she wanted most. They offered her the way back, a room at the rebuilt mill, a place among them again. A quiet folding of her back into the life that had thrown her out, as though the closed door had never happened. The Reverend spoke the words. He called it setting things right. He called it welcoming her home. And the whole group waited, certain of her answer. Certain that a woman who had suffered so much out in the cold could want only one thing: to come back in. Della was quiet for a long moment. She looked at their faces. At Harlan Crane, unable to meet her eyes. At the Reverend, holding out his careful welcome like a gift. She looked at the offer, the warm room, the place at the table, the end of exile, and she felt, one last time, the old pull of it, the ache for the light in the window, the longing to simply be let back in, to stop being the woman on the outside. It would have been so easy to say yes, to go home, to be forgiven, to let the winter become a story she told by a warm valley fire someday. But then she looked at her daughter, standing quiet beside her, and she remembered the girl's words in the dark. I don't want to be the people they made leave again. And Della understood something that settled the whole long question in an instant, clean and clear as the smoke finding its way through the stone. If she went back down to that room, on their offer, at their invitation, then her home would always be a thing the town had given her. And a thing that can be given can be taken away. She would spend the rest of her days grateful, careful, small. A woman let back in. A woman who remembered every single day that her belonging depended on their goodwill. And her daughter would learn that lesson right alongside her. That safety was a gift from the powerful, to be earned and feared and never quite trusted. She would not do that to the girl. She would not do it to herself. Not after this winter. Not after everything the cold had taught her. So she gave them an answer no one on that mountain expected. Thank you, Della said, and she meant it. There was no bitterness left in her to make it sharp. That's a kind thing to offer. Kinder than what was offered to me the last time I stood in front of this town. The Reverend began to smile. But no, she said. The smile faltered. I'm not coming back down. A confused silence spread through the group. They had braced for tears of gratitude. They did not know what to do with a gentle, absolute refusal. You'd rather stay up here? Harlan Crane finally asked, and there was real bewilderment in it. Through another winter? Alone? Della looked around the ravine. At the shelter she had carved from nothing. At the green growing where the world swore green could not grow. At her daughter, standing straight-backed and unafraid beside her. I'm not alone, she said quietly. I haven't been alone since the morning you closed that door. I just didn't know it yet. She stepped back toward her shelter, toward her daughter, toward the warm and glowing life she had built with her own 2 hands. You offered to give me a home, she said. But that's the whole trouble, don't you see? I already have one. And this one, no one gave to me. Which means no one can ever take it away. She let that land. Down there, I'd be a woman you let back in. Up here, I'm a woman who built her own door, and I've learned which of those two women I'd rather my daughter grow up watching." The town did not fully understand it that day, but they felt the weight of it. The strange, quiet dignity of a woman turning down the very thing they had all assumed she was suffering for. She had not stayed out of spite. There was no anger in her refusal. She had stayed because she had discovered something up here in the cold that was worth more to her than being let back in. She had discovered that she could stand on ground that was entirely her own. And a person who has learned to stand on her own ground does not trade it, ever, for a borrowed seat by someone else's fire, no matter how warm, no matter how sorry they finally are. The mill owner was the last to leave the ravine that day. He lingered at the mouth of the shelter, turning his hat in his hands, and at last he said the thing he had climbed the mountain to say, though it came out rough and halting. "I should have listened to you," Harlan Crane said. "About the roof. About all of it. If I had." He could not finish. Della looked at him. The man at the root of it all. The closed door. The clumped sack of flour. The long, cold road up the mountain. And she found, searching herself, that she had no wish to punish him. That wish had died somewhere in the long dark, and she did not miss it. "You should have," she agreed simply. "No cruelty in it, just the truth." He nodded and lowered his head, ready to carry that weight back down the mountain. "But Mr. Crane," she said. He looked up. "That closed door is the reason I found this place," she said slowly. "Your worst act sent me to the best thing I've ever built. I won't thank you for it. You don't get to be thanked for cruelty that happened to turn out well." She paused. "But I've stopped carrying it, and you should stop carrying it too. Not because you've earned it, because a man who spends the rest of his life bent under one bad morning is no use to anyone. Least of all the people who still depend on him down there." Harlan Crane stared at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she had known him, the hard, unbothered man's face broke, just slightly, and something like release passed over it. He put his hat back on. He straightened his shoulders, and he walked back down the mountain, a lighter man than he had come up. Not forgiven, exactly, but freed, which, from a woman he had wronged so deeply, was a mercy he knew he had not deserved. Della never did go back to the valley to live, but the ravine did not stay a place of two either. Because once the town understood she would not come down, a few of them, the humble ones, began to come up, not to bring her back, to learn from her. Caleb Dorr, the carpenter, was the first. The broad, loud man who had spent the whole winter mocking the very idea that anyone could live up in the high rocks. He climbed the ravine with his tools on his back and his hat in his hands, and he asked the widow to show him how warm stone could be made to hold a season's heat. He was not an easy student. Old pride does not die quickly in a man like that. There were moments, that first day, when Della watched him start to reach for his old certainties, start to explain to her how a thing ought to be done, before he caught himself and remembered why he had climbed all that way. But he learned, slowly, honestly. She showed him the oven. She let him put his hands on the sandstone, feel where the heat lived and where it fled. She told him, without a shred of pride, about every loaf she had ruined learning it. The raw ones, the burnt ones, The 3 days of precious flour turned to something not even a hungry child could swallow. And Caleb Dorr, who had built things his whole life and prided himself on knowing how, understood at last that he had never once in all his years built a thing that answered back the way this cave did. A thing that punished a careless choice and rewarded a patient one. A thing that had to be listened to, not just commanded. You learned all this alone, he said, near the end of that first day. It was not quite a question. It was closer to an apology, though he did not have the words to make it one. Not alone, Della said. She glanced toward her daughter, who was showing a young mother from the valley how to press a seed into the prepared soil, gentle and sure, the way she had done it 100 times now. There were 2 of us, and the mountain. The mountain taught me most of it. I just had to stop being too proud to be taught. Caleb Dorr looked at the woman his town had thrown away, and he took that lesson down the mountain with him, and he did not forget it. Young mothers came to learn how a garden might be coaxed to life beneath the snow. Old ones came with knowledge in their hands and nowhere left to put it, and Della taught them all, freely, asking nothing because knowledge kept locked away goes stale as flour in a leaking roof. The forgotten crease in the mountains became a place people climbed up to, instead of a place they had cast a woman out to. And that, Della thought, was a fine thing for the world to become. But it was never the point. The point had been settled that day she said no. On a still evening near the very end of that first long winter, the oven released one final wave of warmth as another loaf finished baking. Nell lifted it carefully and set it on the wooden rack to cool. Steam drifted up through a crack in the crust, curling into the warm air. Della stood in the mouth of the ravine, looking down at the distant lights of the valley she had chosen not to return to. She felt no ache now, no pull. The light in the window had stopped being a place she longed to sit beside. It had become, simply, a place she used to live, in a life that had belonged to a different, smaller woman. She did not miss that woman. She had spent a whole winter believing the cruelest thing the town did to her was to throw her out into the cold. She understood now that they had done something else entirely, without meaning to. They had cut her free. Free of a life where her belonging depended on their goodwill. Free of a table where her seat could be pulled out from under her at any moment. Free of the terrible, quiet work of being grateful to people who held her safety in their hands. They had thrown her out of a borrowed life, and she had walked, without quite knowing it, straight into her own. Nell came and stood beside her mother in the fading light. "Do we still have a home?" the girl asked. The same question. From that first frozen morning, when the mill door had closed and the whole world had gone silent. But she asked it without fear now, only wondering. Della put an arm around her daughter's shoulders and drew her close. "We do," she said. "But I want you to understand what kind, sweet girl, because it matters." Nell looked up at her. "When they closed that door," Della said, "I thought they'd taken our home. And for a while, I thought if they ever opened it again, they'd be giving it back." She shook her head slowly, watching the valley lights flicker far below. "But a home someone can open and close on you was never really yours. It was only ever alone. And you spend your whole life afraid they'll call it in." She turned her daughter gently to face the warm, glowing shelter behind them. The oven, the green rose, the jar alive against the stone. This one we made, Della said, out of a place nobody wanted, with nothing but our own hands and our own stubbornness. And that's why it's the first home we've ever had that no one on this earth can take away from us. Nell was quiet a long moment, taking it in the way she took in everything now, slowly, keeping it forever. Because they didn't give it to us, the girl said softly. Because they didn't give it to us, Della agreed. The only thing that's truly yours is the thing you built when no one would help you build it. And the child leaned into her mother's side and looked out at the last of the light on the mountains and understood that she would never again be a person who waited by a door, hoping to be let in. She had watched her mother turn the whole world's coldest morning into something no one could ever close on them again. Out beyond the ravine, the winter loosened its grip, one slow degree at a time. The passes would open soon. The world would become crossable. And Della Voss, who could have walked back down into the warm and waiting arms of the town that wronged her, chose instead to stay on the ground she had made her own, not out of anger. The anger was long gone. She stayed for something far quieter and far stronger, for the simple, hard-won knowledge that a woman who builds her own shelter never again has to beg for a place in someone else's. The town below had once decided she was worth nothing, and she had discovered, out in the cold, that they had never had the right to decide her worth at all. That right had always been hers. It had just taken a closed door and a long winter and a forgotten hollow in the rock to teach her how to pick it up and carry it and never set it down again. The lights flickered in the valley. The warm oven glowed in the ravine. And a woman who had walked into the mountains with nothing but a ruined sack of flour and a frightened child stood in the doorway of a home that was, at last, entirely and unshakably her own. She had not been let back in. She had built something better than the thing they could offer, and she had never, not once, needed their door to open again. Years later, when Nell was grown, with a straight back and steady eyes and hands that knew how to build, people would sometimes ask her about the winter in the mountains, about the widow and the ravine, the story the whole region came to tell. And she would say the same thing, every time, that most people misunderstood it, that they thought it was a story about surviving the cold, or about a town that got what it deserved, or about a woman proving her worth to the people who had doubted her. It was none of those things, she would say. It was a story about a mother who stood in the snow on the worst morning of her life, with a ruined sack of flour and a frightened child, and nowhere in the world to go, and who decided in that moment not to walk toward the doors that had closed against her, but toward the one place nobody wanted, and who taught her daughter, without ever once saying it out loud, the only lesson that had ever really mattered, that your worth is not a thing other people hand you, that your home is not a thing other people can take away, that the coldest morning of your life, faced with your own two hands and a stubborn refusal to quit, can become the doorway to the truest thing you will ever build. The valley grew old. The town changed. The mill passed to other hands, and the story slowly settled into the kind of tale grandmothers tell by the fire. But the ravine stayed warm, and the door stayed open, for anyone willing to climb up out of the cold and come in.